Why does it take longer to clear this border post than to fly across the Atlantic? The border post sits south of the Democratic Republic of Congo, between two towns that share the same name. And leading up to the border post is a two-lane road holding arguably one of the most economically critical traffic jams on Earth. This traffic jam has at some point stretched 48 kilometers, 56 kilometers, and on at least one occasion about 100 kilometers. Imagine a queue of trucks reaching almost the entire distance from London to Oxford. And during the worst of it, drivers reported moving about 2 kilometers a day. And here's the interesting part. The cargo moving along this stretch at the crawling pace is copper and cobalt. The metals inside the phone you're likely watching this on, and the electric car that's meant to play a big part in our planet's future. So the obvious question is why? And yes, the usual suspects of colonialism and corruption have been a catalyst, but they don't form the full picture. So let's look into it. Let's look at some figures to understand the scale of the problem. The DRC produced around 3.5 million tons of copper in 2025. That is the second largest output on Earth, only behind Chile. It also supplies roughly 70% of the world's cobalt. And almost all of that leaves the country the same way, by road, through Zambia, towards the ports in Tanzania, South Africa, Mozambique, and Namibia. Imagine that scale of commerce funneling through one border post. Let me put this commerce into perspective. The DRC's 2025 copper output at just over 13,000 US dollars per ton, according to the London Metal Exchange, puts the value at around 41 billion US dollars. That's roughly the nominal GDP of Iceland, sitting on the back of flatbed trucks stuck in first gear. Now, let's revisit the first of the two usual suspects. The border that sits between Zambia and the DRC once ran through northern Rhodesia and Belgian Congo. It literally splits the town of Kasumbalesa, which sits on both sides of the border. To add to the border confusion, the Copper Belt is both a province entirely inside Zambia's borders, but also a geographical region in both countries. But here's the thing. Malaba, between Kenya and Uganda, sits on a colonial line too. So does Chirundu between Zambia and Zimbabwe, and both of those borders clear trucks in a fraction of the time. The colonial map design explains why there's a border here, but not why Kasumbalesa specifically fails to function to its capacity. For that, we need to look beyond imaginary lines. Kasumbalesa is less of a border between two countries and more like a border between a region and the ocean. 5 transport corridors meet here. In 2021 alone, this post handled over 250,000 trucks and over 3 million pedestrian crossings. And when the DRC's own output increases, which grows rapidly year on year, another truck joins the queue. Not just outbound, the mines import nearly everything they consume, from diesel to chemicals for processing mineral ore. So the traffic is heavy in both directions. I found the effects of this in a mathematical study called queuing theory. The theory states that when arrivals exceed the service rate, the queue doesn't get proportionally longer. It grows exponentially. For the maths enthusiasts watching or listening, please correct me if I've oversimplified it. So, if the volume of arrivals is the problem, why not limit traffic? In January 2025, the DRC imposed a cap on trucks entering from Zambia, but more than 600 trucks were arriving daily against that cap. The result was a 56-kilometer queue, which only shrank after authorities negotiated to raise the limit by 500 trucks a day. And just a year earlier, the DRC banned imports of Zambian beer, soft drinks, and lime, and then protests broke out. Trucks were damaged, drivers were assaulted, and the border became non-functional for several days. The border post has since continued to operate at its breaking point, where any disturbance, whether a policy change, a protest, or bad weather, could tip it from slow to stationary. And when a system becomes this unreliable for this long, something intriguing happens. People stop waiting for it to be fixed. They build their own system. Just outside the tracks is an economy that actually moves, and quite rapidly. It runs on bicycles and wheelbarrows. The only thing that slows them down is the operator pushing the cargo. The porters unload the trucks on the Zambian side and carry the payload across the border. They don't wait around in customs queues and they don't burn fuel. They just keep moving. According to research cited by the ECDPM, this informal economy generates around $2.5 million a day. The bottleneck has become a prime marketplace for local traders around the stationary tracks. Drivers stuck for days carry charcoal stoves and buy charcoal along the route. Food vendors sell out their daily stock by midday, and independent foreign exchange traders earn their entire livelihood from this queue of trucks alone. Ironically, the failure of this transit system has created an economy that the local community immediately benefits from, one that doesn't require raw materials to flow outwards before the money trickles back into the national economy. So, how do you fix a broken border post? In 2009, Zambia signed a concession agreement for Kasumbalesa. It was a public-private partnership for a modern facility with parking for about 1,800 trucks and electronic pre-clearance. It opened in 2011, but a decade later, Kasumbalesa had the longest release times of comparable borders on the continent. Border posts with no concession and other facilities cleared traffic far faster. The failure was actually procedural. For example, track documents were uploaded to a digital customs system before the journey even began. On the DRC side, officials would not act on the digital files. They waited for clearing agents to submit scanned copies of the same documents. Not just that, the border post only processed cargo between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. until government officials from both countries came together to renegotiate in 2025. The solution? An extension of the opening hours to between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. While this may be a game changer for a small business, keeping the gates open 7 hours longer does very little for an operation the size of Kasumbalesa. Instead, the key is proper, deliberate investment into a unified clearance system, whether paper or digital, and quality human capital. Redirecting traffic to other border crossings has also been tried. It hasn't worked. It just points the traffic jam in a different direction. So for now, this is the current state. A flood of the world's most strategically demanded metals being pushed through a gate whose operational resilience has become predictably fragile. And this degradation hasn't happened in a day. It's been a result of compounding quick fixes. Finally, let's revisit the other of the two usual suspects, corruption. It happens and it's documented. But corruption as a complete explanation for the failure of the border post raises a question. Why is this border so much worse than other borders in the same countries run by officials from the same institutions? Consider who earns from a stationary track. Toll gates that collect whether traffic flows or crows. Truck parks where drivers pay for parking at facilities that are already overwhelmed. Government agencies that can insert a stamp or a fee. And of course, the informal economy too. Lots of individual actors, each rationally defending a small revenue stream, collectively producing an outcome no one would choose. A traffic jam this valuable, held together by this many small interests, does not reform itself from within. The line on the map was drawn in a European conference room. The traffic jam was built later by growth and geometry and by thousands of small incentives, each one perfectly rational, adding up to 100 kilometers of stillness. And for the local trader who's found the market here, making a living is far more important than the impact an electric car may someday make on the environment. In fact, the dream of electric cars seems far-fetched for a continent that can't seem to keep the lights on. Well, Africa actually has the capacity to generate plenty of energy, but why the continent struggles to keep the lights on is a much deeper story than it seems. Come back for that one. Thanks for watching.